All right, let's get started, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate session of Straxferno. Today we'll be talking about the initialization of the processing, so how different plugins are made and how this process works. I posted a few study questions that we can go through, but yeah, I think it's best to start just with any questions you had. I don't have much of an intro this time myself. I think the code is relatively straightforward, if a bit yeah, there's things like recursion and so happening. So I hope you you had fun reading it. So who would like to start with some questions on this this topic?
So I had two questions.
Sure.
Let's see. The first is, should I share the screen or do you? Yeah, you can already see it here. Like in this get component, I have this arrow.
There's an arrow. Yeah. This.
Yeah. What does that do?
So that's Python type annotation. So that means that it's just a signal that this is producing a type of this this type. So this is a little class that's defined here in processor.py. So this isn't checked during runtime. It's a new feature that was added in Python 3.6, but it can be checked by static tools. There's something called, I believe, MyPy, that can go through your code and check whether the types are correct, so that when get components gets used somewhere, that here components, that it knows what it is. At least that's the idea. I don't know if that actually works in this case. But great, so the other idea is that the editor, your editor can sometimes check this. And in this case, yeah, PyCharm should know something. I mistyped components, I think that's why. Here we go. So here it knows that, hey, I'm dealing with a processor component object. So if I had put some random attribute here, it might have said, hey, okay, well, this is also just a typo. But that's the idea. So it's a way of statically checking your code.
And the other was, you have this.
If you want to share the screen, that's fine too. But otherwise, I'll just go to where you point me.
Find like where was it again?
Okay.
So it's you append this this dictionary somewhere.
So where is this? Append a dictionary.
Yeah, no, you add the do compute dictionary, and you where is it? You add, here it is. It's line 500-ish. Context.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have these loaders and these savers and these scenes.
That's right.
In the function below it, they are non-local, so then they are in the different scope. But to compute is not in the non-locals.
Yeah.
Shouldn't it be out of scope?
So these things are necessary because if you suppose I have some variable x here, and here I assign some different variable x, then Python, when interpreting this, will say, hey, you're assigning a new variable in a different scope, so this is a new variable. Yeah. But if I were just to access this variable, then it's fine. Then it, I guess this wouldn't be enough. You would actually have to do something like this. It's really just accessing it. Yeah. That's fine. There shouldn't be, well, here it does say unresolved reference, so I guess what I'm about to tell you is wrong. The idea is that Python, in case you're just reading a variable and not modifying it, would be okay with this. So my answer was going to be that that was the reason that this thing wasn't modified, but it's treated in the same way as loaders and savers and scene, right? And not.
But it will be modified because you add a plugin to the dictionary.
Exactly, right. Yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, we can investigate this. Let's just try it. So suppose I'm defining a function. Right. So if I have here x equals 3, so this is going to work. And if I here assign x something else, it prints out the 4, but in this scope it's still the 3. So here it's said, yeah, you're modifying it, so this is a local variable. Let's see what happens if I do non-local. So no binding function. The non-local thing only applies when you're actually in some other scope. So it's been a while, but once I understood exactly how this works, but now I do not. Okay. So F no longer defined. Okay. So this returns 4. Or it prints 4. It doesn't. Yeah. Okay. I think the answer in this case is just I don't know. We can try, and so you can add this to non-local, but it suggests that maybe these things are not necessary either. And try that, see how that works. Looks like it's not complaining, so let me run some tests. Okay, don't forget to activate my environment. I think I still have Pi36 as environment. And let's see. Okay, I guess it was Pi37 after all. It's not complaining. So I guess you're completely right. This whole non-local business wasn't necessary because we're not reassigning these variables. We're just accessing them. And yeah, we are modifying the object it points to, but we're not saying, oh, to compute, here's a new dictionary you should point to. So yeah, good catch. This whole thing was unnecessary.
Okay. So you can access it and modify it secretly, well you shouldn't.
Well, there's modifying and modifying, right? If I were to say,
but so like if the dictionary would already have an entry, you would not be able to modify that entry, but you can add something like that.
So I'm able to do anything I want with the object. What I cannot do is reassign the variable to another object. In that case, Python will say, aha, this to compute, that's a new variable. And then you're not modifying the outer thing. Then you would have to say either global or in this case non-local, because I don't want it to refer to the module global scope, but just one scope. But that's not happening in this case. I'm just accessing the object, and as it happens, one of those accesses modifies something, but it doesn't reassign the variable.
Okay.
Nice. So that's, I don't think there is still one non-local here in get plugins. Wonder if we can remove that too then. Let's see. Looks like it. Yeah. So I guess this was just a misunderstanding on my part, that I thought that this was necessary and I confused these two ways of modifying functions. Nice. Thanks, Peter.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. More questions that people had.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
The times, but it is referring to even one course before that about the chunking. So I have a bit of a problem with understanding let's say the chunk time space and the time space within a chunk. I think if I get it correctly, in the chunk time space we cannot have any gaps, right? One chunk ends, another chunk starts. There will never be a gap between two chunks. Okay.
Yes.
Why
this
is
we haven't
obviously
checked this yet explicitly for all data types, but it is checked explicitly at the end. So the final data type really can't have a gap, then Strax would crash. But we should probably check it also for the others. But the idea is indeed there won't be any gaps. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That's already it.
Good. So you were saying there was another time space you were thinking about?
So obviously within a chunk, for example, if you have peaks, you can have gaps between peaks, while for chunks you cannot. And but I was not 100% sure about that.
Yeah.
So this was already the question.
Yeah. No. So in the chunk there can be gaps. In fact, there should be gaps in the chunk, because we, for example, for records, we want to split chunks at a part where there is a gap. So then either at the beginning of the next chunk or the start of this chunk, sorry, the beginning of the next chunk or the end of the current chunk, there has to be some time where there is nothing. So that should happen quite often, in fact. Yeah. Okay. More questions? Okay, if there are no more, then I guess we go to the study questions. Just go through them, and maybe that raises more questions down the line. So let's look here. Please put the following significant events in the life cycle of a plugin in order. Okay, so did anybody try this this exercise? Maybe you can point out where the different things happen, so we can put them on the screen. So what's the first thing that happens?
There was one thing I was slightly confused about, because the setting of the run ID, that's done on initialization, but that's not in init.
Yeah, that's right. So this is why this question is here, because there are many places where the initialization of a plugin is done. Don't know if this is, well, it's definitely not great code, but perhaps it can be improved. But then you first need to know where everything happens. So, okay, let's just go through some of them. So let's see where the run ID attribute is set. Let me close some unnecessary things. Okay, so we have here in plugin, there's the init. And as you pointed out, Peter, it's not there. So you see there's no run ID being set here. So this init is being called from context.py inside get plugin here. This is actually the call to init here in line 416, where we get to the plugin class registry and we do the first call. So here is where the run ID is being set. So that's right after the call to init. Okay. Right, so that takes care of these two. But this still isn't the first thing that happens. There's something that happens even earlier from this list. Did anybody find that?
It's the configuration.
So the configuration is set in several places. There's one right here, so right after the init. And it happens another time later with tolerant equals false. But it definitely doesn't happen earlier, because you can't set the config if you haven't initialized it. But there's one of these things that happens even before the plugin gets initialized. So maybe I'm stretching the concept of a life cycle a little bit. Maybe it's sort of predestination or however you want to call it. One of these things happens sooner.
I guess you have to set the default for provides, right? It can't be in the registry if it doesn't have a provides.
That's it, exactly, right, you'll see. So if you look at how plugins get registered, so let's go to register. Here's where the defaults for provides is set. So that's actually a class level attribute, and Jossie's completely right. You cannot register it if you don't know what it provides. But there are many plugins that actually rely on this. If you go to Straxferno, here plugins, peak processing. Okay, this one does provide it. yeah, peak positions doesn't say what it provides. So the way we do that is there's this function over here, camel to snake, which will take the class name, go to it, and then run this this regular expression that will will convert k from camel to snake, and you can see this, of course, a Stack Overflow question. Right. So yeah, we just did this. I don't know why there seems to be some kind of repetition. I bet there's a way to do this with one regular expression, but I don't know. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens. So that's the first thing. So setting the default for provides. We did the call to init, call to run ID. Can anybody tell me where setup is called? What is setup actually? What does that do?
Because before you start calling the user-defined process, right?
Yeah, so it's before we start calling user-defined processing. So could you give me a practical example of what you might do in there? Why would you put something in the setup? Why not just put it in your file and run it immediately?
Maybe if you're going to use it a bunch of times and you don't want to recalculate something every time or something like that, caching and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's a good point. If you why you shouldn't put something in the compute method. So if you want to have some initialization and you don't want to have it in the compute method. But what if I have some initialization, let's say, for example, here I'm importing NumPy. I can import NumPy also just outside the function, so that I could maybe do, but if I want to load some correction map or something, why can I not load that just here in the main code? Right, so suppose you have a plugin that depends on a correction map. Why not load that just here straight into the .py file right after the imports, the correction map?
Could be dependent on the config. Well, it should.
Exactly, yeah. If it depends on the config, you don't know the config here yet. So that would be one reason. Can you think of another reason? Suppose the correction map is purely static and never changes throughout the run.
You don't want the LZ getting at your correction maps?
Yeah, that would be another way. Yeah, okay, very good. So you want to load it from some secret database. Yeah. Think maybe of a plugin like position reconstruction. That does a lot of initialization.
So it's a TensorFlow you're referring to, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Necessary for many other things.
Yeah, right. So you see here peak positions, setup, that's where we import TensorFlow. We don't need TensorFlow usually. So not doing it in the main code saves memory and saves time. And indeed here, when you load the neural net, since that depends on the config, as Jossi pointed out, we can't do it in the main code. So that's why there's this setup function. That's where you put stuff like that. And that's called right before the plugin actually gets going. So this is in get components. So we were previously in get plugins, and here there's some more setup where we load loaders and savers. And then just before we give everything to create a processor, we say, hey, let's run the setup, because by this time it's clear that we're going to be computing. We only call this setup on a plugin that will actually be computed. Okay, so that takes care of this one. And this one is, of course, the last, right? Calls to do compute. That's when you're completely done. Setting complete configuration we discussed. Did anybody figure out why we're calling set plugin config twice?
It's in the comments, right? That one is you set it once but you don't calculate it. So then you don't care if there might be things missing.
Yeah.
And the second time you call it, you only call it on the things you actually want to calculate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So some options are required and they may be missing. But doesn't Strax track all of the options? So if an option is required but missing, then I'm not going to get the same lineage, right? Then I'm going to get some weird thing happening. So I think you're right. That was definitely the reason why we did it. But I don't know whether, I think the idea, sorry, Peter?
But it actually matters because
yeah.
you already catch it before.
Yeah, it might be just like the thing you just pointed out, where it was this non-local that just wasn't necessary. The only reason this would matter, I think, but other people feel free to correct me, is when there is a option that is required but not tracked. So there is an option that doesn't have a default, but it's also not tracked. I can't really think of. Yeah, that would be pretty confusing. So that sounds like a bad thing to do, but yeah, in that case you would. This is why this is necessary. In other cases, I think it's essentially just duplicated.
Isn't it the case for gains, for example?
For gains.
PMT gains.
Okay. That's a good one. Let's look at the PMT gains. So that's in, where is it? Peaklet processing, right? Here, gain model. Yeah, so that doesn't have a default. That's right. So you need to specify it, but there's no default. But it is tracked. We do track what gain model is being used. So a plugin. So if this option were empty, the lineage of the plugin would be different. So then you wouldn't be asking for the right data. So it doesn't make much sense. So what you need is an option which is like, for example, diagnose sorting here, which is not tracked. So it doesn't matter what you specify there for the hash. And it also mustn't have a default, because if it has a default, then yeah, it's not required. Then you can just fall back to the default. So if I were to remove this, or if I were to, let's see here, make this not tracked, which would be terrible, right? Oh, of course you want to track what gain model is being used. Then you have this this mechanism. But I maybe there was another reason, but I don't remember it. But it looks like this is kind of superfluous. So just to show you explicitly where these two cases where it's called are. So one is here. So this is in get plugins. So that's for each plugin. Right after we initialize it, we just set the run ID, we set the configuration. And the other one is right together with the setup. So that's over here. It's just before the setup. So when you have setup being called, then you know that all of your configuration has been set. Otherwise, the plugin wouldn't even initialize. Okay. So a few more things left. So where is infer dtype called? What does infer dtype do?
If you have some slightly more complicated dtype, which you do not specify on the like as what is it, as an attribute of the class, but if it like has some variable which it needs that it then calculates for.
Yeah, that's what it does. Very good. Yeah. So let's see, is that necessary to register the plugin? You need the full data type.
Yeah, so you need to do it at the beginning somewhere.
Okay, well, let's check.
So you should say more or less at the same time where you do the data kind. So
in the, okay, so that's a good point. We'll come back to the data kind in a moment. If we look at where it's registered, the only thing we do here is the provides. Okay. So the only thing needed just to register it is what do you provide? Because then we know when to call on you. You don't yet need to know what the complete data type is. So let's look at the data kind. So that default is set here. Let's see where we ended up. So that's in get plugins again. So right, here's where the initialization happened. The run ID was set, the configuration was set. Here, a variety of other things are set. And then here's the default for data kind being set. Okay, and you're right, here there's a call to fix dtype. So it's after the initialization of a plugin, after we've set most of the configuration options, except these perhaps really weird options that don't exist. But then you go to fix dtype, and that's where infer dtype is called. So infer dtype, you can, in principle, make a data type that depends on the configuration. Can you perhaps mention an example of something like that, where that might be useful?
Peaks depends on the number of PMTs.
Bingo, right? You have a field for area per channel that depends on the number of PMTs, which is different per detector. Yeah, and that's why we do it here, not on registration, since by then, at that point, we don't yet know the config. Okay, so that takes care of this. And we just saw the default for data kind too. So that gives you the complete order. Let me just show it to you here. So during plugin class registration, we set the default for provide, since we need that to call upon it. In get plugins, we first call init, there's some very basic stuff. Then we set the run ID and the complete configuration. And this tolerant means that if a required option doesn't have a default, it does still allow it. But as we discussed, it doesn't matter because all options should be tracked if they matter at all. Then we set the data kind default, infer data type if it's needed. And then when you get to the very end of the initialization process, so you've done all the, so this is actually not in get plugins, this is in get components, right? So we had the call to set up in context. Right, so this is at the end of get components. And get components is the thing that calls get plugins. So you first call get plugins for all of the plugins that make up your computation graph. So even if you're just asking for event info, you're gonna create the plugin graph all the way to raw records. And that's necessary because we need to know what is the hash of this particular event info. And it depends also on the settings of its dependence. If somewhere in peak processing, I've used a different gain model, that changes what your events are going to look like. So that's why we need to build this entire chain down to raw records. Then we go through the whole rigmarole of finding out, is this data there? Can we load it? If not, is that a problem or is it okay? What do we need to save? And then finally, when we've determined what we need to compute, then we set the configuration a second time, and then we do setup. So that's what happens here. And during processing, we of course just call to compute. Okay, any questions on this? Right, and let me make one more remark on this. When you build this entire plugin chain, all the way down to raw records here in get plugins, that takes time. I have to go through all of the plugins to do this in it. I don't have to go to setup, so I'm not importing TensorFlow, loading the big neural net, but there is some work involved here. So if you're loading 1,000 runs, then what it will do is it will 1,000 times create this entire plugin graph. That's a bit inefficient, right? But it's necessary because at the moment, the hash for a plugin can change run by run. It's possible that your processing runs, say, a month ago, where the default for a neural net or the gain model was something else. So that's why Strax has to go through this process for every run, figure out what is the hash that applies according to your current context. Maybe in a couple of months already, this will become annoying and we'll want to find some way of speeding this up. do you have any ideas maybe how could we speed up this process so that we don't have to go through this entire hash computation for every run?
Make a super run?
Yeah, very good. That's one way to do it. So you could get those 1,000 runs, create one big super run that references all of them, and then when you load them, it will just load that super run. At the moment, super runs are a bit experimental, so I hope they work. And also, well, okay, if you load raw records, you can't save the raw records for 1,000 runs in one super run. That would be one folder with a gazillion files, and that's not going to work. But you could imagine iterating over all of the raw records from many runs and to select a few of them. So this is a great idea, and at one point I had in my mind that super runs would be all the rage, and every day the shifters would create a super run for the data that day, but I don't think we're there yet. But that's certainly one way. So yeah, we could go more into super runs. Suppose that does not work. Does anybody have maybe another suggestion of avoiding all this work here? If you load 1,000 runs, make 1,000 graphs and compute their hash. So what would be a generic solution for these kind of cases where you do a lot of repetitive work and it's kind of the same every time? What do you then do in coding? You're muted, Johan.
You're cached somewhere, but
yeah, exactly. Right, but as you say, that might be a bit tricky because when your context changes, perhaps these hashes for different runs change. So you could do this. You could have, for example, an official context. You could build for that official context at, say, weekly intervals, a table saying, okay, for this data type, this run, this is the hash. Store that in MongoDB, and then you could load that and save yourself a lot of work here. That, of course, requires that this database is kept up to date. So yeah, there will be some work, but that will be one other way of avoiding it. Okay, any other suggestions on how to avoid this work? Right, you're all going to feel this work in a couple of months when there are more runs and you all want to load them. I'm just listening. I don't have a particular other idea myself. So. Okay. I guess one more thing which you could do, but that has other implications, is ensure that all the runs have the same hash in the context. So that would mean that you cannot have in the configuration any option that changes run by run. So for example, the option would instead be, for example, the thing that you cannot have is, for instance, here, default per run. Here's this is the event positions, the corrections to events. And here you say, hey, depending on the run number, I'm going to apply a different field distortion map. So if you want to avoid this work, you cannot do this. So instead, you would have this be some option that says time-dependent field distortion version 3. And then in the setup, you would maybe find out, okay, actually I have this run, so let me load this particular field correction map. Because in the setup, you know the whole configuration and your run ID.
What comes to my mind right now, I don't know if this is feasible. Couldn't you, as like an option or something, give a higher data kind the hash of the plugins it's built out of? So, and then compare basically, not so you don't have to compare all the hashes, but just the highest level hash. And if it also depends on the same hashes, it has to be the same. So you're basically creating a hash every time you do one calculation of a plugin.
Okay, so you're saying perhaps we can simplify the hash computation by maybe saying, hey, I see the same lower level plugins in every run that you're loading. Let's compute the hash for these guys first, and maybe don't have such a setting. Is that what you're saying?
I think I'm trying to say that basically you're creating a hash of the, like as you're doing it already for example, if you load peaklets, and then you get a hash for that. But maybe give that hash also to the next plugin, so it knows which configuration basically it relies on, or which hash it relies on. And then if you just compare the highest level of data, you'll still have like 3 hashes. One being the one that it's having, and one it's relying on, and that it would be sufficient to compare these, right? Or just even the highest level hash. Why would we have to compare every level of
I think I'm getting what you mean. So let's look at one of these hashes, or the lineages that underlie them. So for example, here's event info, it's very high level data type. And you have here the lineages for many different plugins. So we already pass all of the configurations of their dependents. They are all part of this one hash. So this hash already encodes kind of all the hashes of all the previous plugins that came before it. But you're saying, hey, we can maybe also pass the hash of just this, and that would help.
So as I'm understanding, you're creating, or you're checking every hash every time you load a run, right? You, like, for each data kind, for each plugin, you're creating a hash, and you're comparing all the, or you have to recreate all the hashes from the config, and then you compare all of them, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
So when you're
How it's
loading
done right
data,
now? Okay, maybe I
when you're
misunderstood.
loading, okay, now it's a good point. So what exactly is this work that I'm talking about? Is it comparing hashes? Is it computing the hashes? So what I'm talking about here is just the work that happens here in get plugins. So what happens here is configuration is checked, a class is initialized, we initialize a few more classes. Yeah, here we compute the lineage for every plugin, and yeah, then maybe compute the data type for that plugin. So that is the work that's done. So yeah, you could say, hey, maybe not all of this is necessary, because all I really want is just the lineage of the plugin. I don't need to set the data type for that plugin. So you could maybe try to reduce this work in some way, but we're not directly comparing hashes against, for example, stored hashes. That's only when you're loading data. This is just when you're computing it. But I'm assuming here that this is actually a relevant piece of work, and I think it is, because I once checked it when I loaded like many thousands of runs, but I could be wrong. Maybe there's now some other piece of code that takes more time, not get plugins. So yeah, but perhaps this is a good point to say that, hey, maybe we should first profile it to see what is actually taking the most work, and then start thinking about how can we make this more easy.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Went off on a bit of a tangent from your suggestion, but okay, more questions on this.
Does the hash depend on the run ID? Is that one of the problem?
So yeah, that's one of the, it doesn't usually depend on the run ID. So if your plugin doesn't have any run ID dependent settings, it does not. For example, if we look here in this, let's see, if we have a lineage. So here there is event positions, which has a particular field distortion map. That's one of the settings here. So this doesn't depend on the run ID as such, right? The lineage is just this, and the run ID doesn't appear in this. However, the default settings can depend on the run ID. So let's look here in event processing. So your context basically says, well, when you're asking for a run somewhere between 0 and the first sign turn 1 run, then this is my default option. And when you're asking for one between these, then I'm using this default option. So you don't really have this problem if you were to specify, I want this particular field distortion map, regardless of the run. Then you could imagine some shortcut where you would just compute the plugins once, you have the lineage hash, and then you can start loading data because you know what hash you want, and that's valid for all runs. But because your context specifies, hey, my field distortion map needs to change run by run, Strax cannot do that. So in the end, you're right, there is a dependence on the run ID, or at least a potential dependence, because Strax allows you to specify defaults like this. And that's what's creating this extra work when you're loading 1,000 things.
Okay. I'm just wondering that we used to have this memorize function, decorator that you can, like, if given the same input, you might remember how to, like, throw out the result.
Yeah, that's a good point. So indeed, we can use some kind of caching mechanism. Perhaps this doesn't even need to be at the database level, but we can check in Strax at some earlier point in this chain of constructing plugins, hey, but this is just going to go down the exact same alley. So let's stop the process here. Yeah, and load some memorized thing. Yeah. Yeah, good suggestion. More questions or suggestions? Okay, I think we've covered this. Let's see, Johan already made a pull request, and several other people almost made the same pull request, so that's great. If you see other code goofs in Strax, always feel free to make a pull request. Certainly those small things will usually improve and merge quickly. Any other questions on this week's code? Okay, then we could do a few things. We still have some time. We could briefly go through some of the open pull requests that are there. I think that might be a nice thing to do, just to get everybody familiar with some of the ongoing work. I could also give a very short intro into next week. But let's look at the pull request briefly. Maybe we can identify some things over there. By the way, a few of you may have seen that I sent a few people invites already for this organization, X Foundation. That's just so that people who are making pull requests or are being requested as reviewers can be tagged, or so you can, for example, here, in a pull request from Daniel, suppose that I want to suggest somebody to review it, then I can do that. So yeah, if you make a pull request to Strax, then yeah, don't see any problem adding you to this organization. It also doesn't mean that you are now the Strax maintainer. We can discuss how exactly that's going to work. I also want to discuss that with the analysis coordinators. But yeah, so if you find yourself getting tagged somewhere, then that might be related. or if you want an invite and you don't have one, just let me know. Okay. So let's see. This one we already looked at. So that's the one that was assignment for this for today. Right. So you're on fixed here, an unused variable, 2 f strings. You didn't find any other similar goofs, right? I mean, I just scanned through it and found these, but. Okay, but in this case, looks like not. So in this case, I just approved it and we can merge this easily. It's just an improvement. I didn't actually see any of the Travis checks here. It's a bit interesting. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so you can see that we do a couple of checks for each pull request. So this is the most important one, the Travis check. So the build must pass. So we do all these unit tests. This one's also kind of important, that you didn't mess up the code too much.
Can I ask something about tests?
Yeah, sure.
What is the best way to compare floats with each other? Because this is currently an issue I have with one of my tests.
Yeah. Do you maybe want to show us your test, or shall I go to it? Or
yes, either way. Let me check. So yeah, either you go to one of the open pull requests. It's I think this new hitlet data kind, exactly.
Sure.
And I think if you go into the Travis, then you will see already my test which fails.
Yeah. Okay, so here you see indeed Travis is failing. So let's look at the details. Okay. Oh, it worked on Python 3.7.
It works sometimes, but sometimes it fails due to floating point numbers, and I'm already using this math dot is close, or is how it was called.
You mean test conditional entropy. Hypothesis flaky, produced unreliable results. Fastified on the first call.
This is also sometimes something which pops up, which I haven't figured out yet what this exactly means.
Yeah, so we have this thing called hypothesis, which is basically firing random inputs at your function. And what this is finding out is that, hey, I fired this input at it, then at first it failed, and the second time it didn't. So then it says, yeah, well, first of all, a failure shouldn't happen, and it certainly shouldn't happen in this case. So then it's just giving up and say, yeah, it doesn't work. Okay, so that's one. Let's see if there was another failure. Or is this the only one? This test timings is, you might see that sometimes too. You just put this deadline equals none and then you're okay. So it looks like it's that one. Let's look at the other build. Okay. Here's the same error. Okay, so let's look at your tests. So you have here test conditional entropy. Okay, so you're given array, integers, floats. Okay, let's look at your code. So it's very good that we're discussing this, right? Unit test is what keeps the code healthy. Hitlets.py, so you have somewhere test hitlets. Yeah, here we go. Test conditional entropy. So nice, you wrote a hypothesis test. Very good. I hope you can still read it. I didn't want the soft wrap, so that's also why I generally like 80 character code, but it's not a super hard requirement. Okay, so you have, yeah, that looks good. So you're saying it's failing here. It is close.
For example, yes, at some of the steps. So basically it's 3 times testing the same thing with slightly changed options. Sometimes I normalize, for example, the function, so the data and the template before computing the entropy. Sometimes they do not. And sometimes it really fails, and I put the tolerance, I think, already fairly loose. or fairly high. But still sometimes it's saying, okay, I have 1.02 and the other one has 1.02, I don't know, 5.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you already looked into like float comparison functions. I mean, there are others. There's some in numpy.testing. So there's numpy np testing assert. What exactly was it called? Assert all close or something?
Yeah, I think Chris also just posted the very same function in the chat.
Okay, great.
But Daniel, do you know if it's due to the relative error you're imposing or due to the absolute error? Because if you're doing stuff with logarithms and stuff, I can imagine that, and powers, then I might imagine that the absolute tolerance can be very different from depending what kind of numbers you actually put in.
So yeah, first I did it without the absolute tolerance, but then it's failing if you compare 0 to 0.000 something. So this is why I had also to put the absolute tolerance.
So one thing I can imagine, but this may be just an idea, is you say here if numpy sum. So you proceed even if the sum is within 1 or 2 floating point precisions of 0. So then you could get a case where, yeah, this will be a very dangerously small number. Then you could get into trouble. So perhaps here you want to be a bit more strict on what sort of random inputs you accept. If the input is very close to 0, you already kill it off. So that would be one idea. The other thing is that maybe there are other places where something like this happens, that you have some way where that your computation isn't numerically stable because some input is 0 or something like that.
Okay, thanks. I will try.
Yeah. Other than that, I think this is fine. I mean, yeah. I mean, you can use the numpy function or you can use this, but yeah, you already understand floating point precision is an issue. So. Okay, Daniel, maybe you want to say something about this pull request a little bit so people know what it is.
So yes, I did this pull request because so in the beginning I was just working on plugins for the neutron veto or the muon veto where we only will have something similar to hits and we won't have anything like peaks or in that direction that we have some waveform or something like that. And so in the very first pull request I did, this was a Straxferno only pull request where I just put the in-veto plugins and it was fine. Then I get some feedback that I should change certain things to be more, to rely more on already existing functions. But then I also noticed for different analyses like this DPE liquid xenon induced DPE emission probability study that this kind of just PMT hit based data kind can be quite nice also for other cases. And this is why I decided to put all the, let's say, base functions which are needed for these kind of analyses in Strax. I think also small TPCs can benefit from that, where you may also have not the concept of a peak. And so I did certain changes to, for example, also split peaks, that you can also use it with hit data or this new hitlet data kind data. And I introduced a new function. This the other major thing is this get hitlet data, which will get the data of a hit based on where the record index, which we define within find hits, points to, and then tries to get the entire data of this object. And some other smaller functions which computes in the properties and stuff like that.
Okay.
And currently I'm trying to add tests, but since I've never done this before, it's also kind of the annoying part, let's say.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, certainly if it works sometimes and doesn't work at other times. But okay, so a hitlet is, I understood that right, that this is like a hit, but with the some waveform information added, is that right?
So exactly, it's also with the left and right extension.
Okay.
Why the hit is not, because the hit is not extended. And as I said, so what it also shall provide is that, for example, if we have a hit in the TPC at the edge of a record and it overlaps into another record, we will always count this as 2 separate hits. Why this is maybe not desirable for other detectors like the neutron veto, there's also a function which checks first if I have 2 overlapping hits, including this extension, then concatenate them. And then at a later stage with this split peaks, I check then, should we rather split these hits again or keep it as a single hit?
So you're merging hits together and storing, here's the data type.
Exactly. So the data type, I store the data only temporary within the plugin. So I don't want to store the data field in the end. So it's the data field is just a temporary thing within the plugin itself, or maybe for some analyses. For example, in that way, it was quite easy to produce, for example, reproduce what Peter did with its every waveform shape of the PNTs based on lone hitlet data. But I agree, we never should save this data field because it would be huge.
Okay, that sounds interesting. It's not really a hitlet, right? It's kind of a super hit.
Exactly. I thought also about something like hitofant, or I don't know. I was not coming up with a good name, and so since we had peaklets, I decided, okay, let's just call them hitlets.
Yeah, I mean, you get to name it if you make it. That's how it works. But, yeah. Okay, looks cool. So your plan for this is to work on the tests, and then see Johan already reviewed it, or?
Fractions of it. I currently try to find people to review it, since it's a big fraction of code. I would say it's. Also, I have to modify the NVito plugins now accordingly to function with these new functions. But somehow this is how do you say? A difficult operation, because first I thought I should not modify the plugins without someone reviewing the functions. But on the other hand, Joran already pointed out correctly, it would be helpful to get some context in which where these functions are getting used, which means in the end I have to finalize the plugin. But yeah, that's the current status.
Okay, sounds good. So if anybody is interested, feel free to look at this. I think everybody, even if you're not in this X Foundation, you can just submit comments on the pull request. So you can, since we only just added Johan, and he also added these comments. So that's great. So please just go ahead and look at it if you're interested. Okay. Good. So let's see. Let's maybe go from the top down, and then we come to the other ones. So we start with newer ones and go to older ones. Or maybe there's some that we don't need to discuss. Well, but let's look at this one from Daryl that you might that's maybe interesting. So Daryl, do you want to say something about this pull request?
I don't think Daryl's here.
Is Daryl not here? Too bad. Well, then we're not going to discuss pull request. But yeah, it looks like a way of specifying the chunk size. Okay, now I am discussing it, but okay. So he added an extra attribute to the chunk class here, target size. That's a kind of metadata that says, hey, if you're going to save me, what chunk size will you save me with? So it's an interesting idea. At the moment, we don't store any metadata in this chunk class, but you could do it. And he's changing the default chunk size to 200 megabytes. That could be interesting. Maybe we want to check that we don't blow up the memory usage for Strax, but I think it's a good idea. Okay.
So, but while we're on this plugin, there is one thing that might be interesting to discuss, or
Sure.
This is not a plugin, but so if you scroll all the way down, one of these checks is actually complaining about something that Daryl didn't work on, which is this code factor, which says that it's complicated code, but I don't think that.
Yeah, so the funny thing is that it has some criteria for judging whether code is complex, and one of them is probably the line count. So I do think Daryl worked on it. He will at some point.
Yeah, I probably worked on it somewhere, but
yeah, so he added like one line, and that probably just pushed it over the count. Let's see, it's in chunk.py and then merge. So I'm guessing it's, yeah, here merge. So yeah, you can see he added one line, and that just pushed it over the threshold for this thing. So a couple of ways you can deal with this. One is to refactor the function, make it less complex. Of course, if you're the unfortunate person that pushes it over the edge, then yeah, that's then on you. I have one other strategy. Well, there's two. One is to add some kind of comment in this code that says, code factor, maybe you want to skip this this thing. But something I've also sometimes done is you look at the other things this code factor reports. You see here 72 issues. So you could fix one of these issues instead, and then code factor will say, hey, you added an issue and you fixed an issue, so I'm okay. So sometimes you can find some issue that's really easy to fix, and then yeah, so some added comma that doesn't do anything. I've done that a few times when I wanted to pass on a more complex function. So it's a bit of a hack. So these are generally the options that you have. Of course, another option is to ignore the thing and just merge it anyway. And finally, if you're really desperate, the other option would be to go into this pylint.rc and then to remove this complex function check. I suppose it's somewhere here. Okay, it'll have some name. Remove it
just
from
remove
the
the comments, or just remove the comments in the code. That will also help.
Yeah, if it counts the code, yeah, that would be a way. You could make it worse to let it pass the code. That's possible. You see, I already removed a few things where I disagreed with code factor. For example, cyclic imports, we use that all the time. So yeah, maybe it's a bit confusing to some people, but the whole package was based around it. So I wasn't going to refactor it just because code factor said I should. But yeah, those are roughly your options to deal with this. Okay, let's look at a few other pull requests. Right, let's see. So here we have another one from you, Daniel.
It works,
And
except also for this complexity in getItter.
Ah, okay, another check. So do you want to say something about this or how it works?
It's fairly simple. We check within getItter. We check either if the user specified any time range, or if he or she doesn't specify any time range, we get the time range from the metadata, and then compute a progress bar based on that. There can be cases where we don't have any metadata, so then we don't put any progress bar. And also what Joran asked for is to make the entire thing optional.
What's this?
And
context loop exit stack?
This is something which you need to get this with statement. I use this with statement for the progress bar. And you need that to have a with statement where you are not yet sure if you will use it or not. So that's some new feature since Python 3.3. Before that, I had another way to do the very same thing, but this was only Python 3.7 compatible, and so I had to change it to that one.
So you need it if you're not yet sure if you will use it or not. Okay.
Yes.
So I think I need to read up on this.
So the progress bar, as I said, if we, for example, if the user specifies he wants or she wants to have a progress bar, and we have, for example, no metadata, we cannot initialize it, or we can initialize it, but then it has no meaning. And so the with statement becomes meaningless. So either one way would be copying and pasting this very same code with and without the with statement, or using this particular function.
Okay. Okay, I think I would have to read the code to get it, but it seems like an interesting new feature, and the progress bar certainly seems nice. I see you have this here as well. That sounds good. I think maybe in the latest version of TQDM they changed where this is, but doesn't. You'll see the warning if that's the case. Okay, thanks. So here there's just this test, and I see again Johan already commented on it, so that's great. Okay. So then Johan, we get to one of your pull requests. So here there's a cut plugin. So what was your goal for this?
So this was partially preparing for one of the other Straxferno courses, but so the way that the cuts are implemented in Straxen at the moment, it's just copy pasting the same code all the time and just replacing one line and then replacing one other line that is just creating booleans. So I thought maybe we can do this a little bit easier. So I just made I wasn't sure whether this was actually Straxen or Strax because it's not much more complicated, but I decided maybe you can put it in Strax anyway. So what it basically does, it just sets up everything you need to make a cut based on, for instance, events. So it's just a wrap around the normal Strax plugin, just like loop plugin or something, and it has some initialization where you can make it a little bit easier for yourself if you're lazy to write everything down.
Okay.
And it then just returns the Boolean array you want to have for cuts. And then I also tried to write a test, which was also my first attempt to write some tests. But at the moment, it seems to work.
Examples. Yeah. Sounds good. And I see here that Daniel already looked at it. So
yeah,
he
pointed out that he pointed out that you cannot cut on records like this. I don't think you want to cut on records like this, but anyway, in principle you could. So he pointed out correctly that I did something where you assumed something had an end time where it didn't per se have it. Yeah.
Okay. No, sounds good. I think I agree. This is good to have in Strax because small TPCs could also use it, and there's nothing particular Xenon specific in it, so it's a good place to put it. Looks like the tests are passing. Daniel reviewed it, but it doesn't count as towards mergeability. Oh, okay. So did you guys think this was ready to merge, or do you still have a few things you wanna look at?
I think Daniel also offered to also look at the test, and I think you probably will find some other smart things over there.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, just let me know when you guys are ready with this. Then once you've both looked at it, I think it's ready to merge. Sounds like certainly because it's something that is just an addition of features. It doesn't affect anything else. So sounds good. So then we have another one from you, Johan. Adding a
oh yeah, that was mine. I don't think we need to discuss it. It was mainly just adding some extra comments.
Oh yeah.
And I see that now by accident. My cut. I think that by accident also ended up here, but that should.
Okay. Sure. But, if you remove this, I'll be happy to merge it. That's fine. Okay. Then there's one from Chanyu. I see. So Chanyu, do you want to briefly say what this pull request is doing?
Yeah, it's just rather importing feature from packs. Trying to do this saturation correction based on the sum waveform. However, we are still debating whether to put it in Strax or Straxen. I'm like kind of flipping between those two options.
Yeah, so I think other TPCs could in principle also have it. So yeah, it depends whether you're going to use some really Xenon specific thing. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, since this one is using the other PMTs instead of the low-gain PMT, so it should be more universal.
You're saying that this one doesn't use the low-gain PMTs, so it's more low-gain channels.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I agree. That sounds like a universal thing. Okay. Looks like there are already some suggestions for reviewers. Yeah, sounds good. I think it's an important feature to add, and yeah. Okay, so then we'll just wait until one of the reviewers has had a chance to look at it, and then we can proceed, or that's how it works. Mm-hmm.
So would this also be a good time to discuss how we should actually review these kind of pull requests, or is that something more that the analysis coordinators are at some point gonna have a...
Sure, I think it's always good to discuss this. Certainly now that we've gone through a few pull requests, so you've all seen a bit what these things look like. Yeah, I mean, of course the ACs will be involved here. Definitely, I think on Straxferno they'll take a more leading role because that's really Xenon specific. There can also be a lot of pull requests involving like a new correction map and so on. But here on Strax, the things are probably more technical. And even if the ACs may take some kind of management, give some kind of management input, they won't always do all of the reviews, I think. I don't know how many ACs we have here at the moment.
Only me, I think.
Only Shingo, great. Good to have you. But yeah,
I have another aspect because everyone can see this Strax, right? So if we put some cuts here, maybe LZ can follow what we are doing now, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that's even the case for Straxferno. It's also public.
That's
and also
true,
for Lex, for Lex, I don't know actually. Let me check. I thought it was public. Yeah, so LZ can already do all of our Xenon one-ton.
Lux was also public? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think if you make a pull request, it will, or if you open an issue, it will tell you, hey, this is public. You sure you know what you're doing? Here, please read before making an issue. What's this? Get started. Oh, here you go. Please note this repository is public. Okay. Yeah, so that's true. I hope you guys keep it public. But yeah, Straxferno is Xenon code. So if at one point it is decided that you don't want to, then yeah. Though of course people could have already forked pieces of it. So, and Strax will remain public, of course. That's just really the open source part and the generalizing part.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I think we needed to discuss some point with CB, maybe for this issue, maybe. Yeah, maybe we already discussed this, right? If we needed to make Strax and public or not, I think. But yeah, should be public, but especially for some cards or something which related to the current status of data taking analysis, maybe it's a little bit sensitive. Especially LZ is quite have a large overlap in time for us. So.
Yeah. No, I think we had these discussions also during Xenon one-ton, and there were times where we briefly made it private when we were just around unblinding, I think. But then in the end, it was opened again. Also because as soon as you make it closed source, then many of these checks like Travis and other things no longer apply. So then they don't work, or they would work, but you need to pay quite a bit of money to make them work. So there are advantages to it, but of course I respect that Xenon makes its own decisions with regard to this. So yeah, sure, several possibilities there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ira.
Sure. So yeah, given that we don't have that many people left, I don't think this is maybe the best time to make a lot of decisions on how we're going to do this towards the future. But if you've got some suggestions on like how should we do this this reviewing going forward, I think that would be very welcome.
Yeah, perhaps, I mean, what you just showed in Lex, I think it would be absolutely great if we also had a similar statement in Strax and Straxon, that we just always have a format for how a pull request should look. And then you can also make a template, so to say, for how you would review a pull request.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Sort of the standard questions that you go through, see if they make sense. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, and I guess at some point, maybe in a few weeks, would be maybe good to have some kind of developer meetup of people who are interested in taking Strax further from here on, and seeing what are the kind of features that you still want to add, and who's going to do that, etc. Okay, given that we have only a few people left, let me just briefly introduce next week, and then we can close for today, unless somebody wanted to add something and I just interrupted them. Okay, so next week we're going to finish our journey, and we're going to look at the deepest and darkest part of Strax, the mailbox concurrency backend. So this is the system that has been much discussed, and yeah, it's complicated. You'll have to look at some threading code, so you will see things. Let's go to mailbox.py. You will see things like threads being used, and you'll see things like locks being created. So you may want to just look on the internet. So hey, what's a lock? What's a threading condition? These things are all necessary because Strax is this multi-threaded program where every plugin lives in its own thread. And it's communicating with others, and sometimes one goes to sleep and sometimes something else happens. I should note that Yossi is working on a different concurrency backend at the moment based on the streams package. If that works, I think it will be great. I hope that will even be faster, but it will definitely make things like monitoring easier, and you won't have to maintain this 500 line of complex threading code inside a package made by physicists, which is also not so great. But yeah, some people should look at this and know how it sort of functions. And since you're the last people left on this journey, that task will fall to you. Hopefully mailboxes won't be anything you have to deal with, because they'll either be replaced or they'll just not create problems. But otherwise, good to have seen the devil in his eyes at least once. Right. That's all I had to say for this week. Any questions, suggestions, remarks? If not, then thanks for your participation. See you next week.
Thanks so much, Jelle. Ciao.
Thank you. See you. Bye.
Thank you.